Welcome to the 2-Hour channel. Step into the shadows of history where secrets, scandals, and forbidden stories come alive. In the comments below, tell us which city are you watching from and what time is it where you are right now. Let's see where our viewers around the world are tuning in from as we uncover the darkest corners of the past. In April 1859, a transaction took place in the sweltering heat of New Orleans that would eventually freeze the blood of every plantation owner in the Louisiana bayou. Bo Regard Whitmore, a man whose ambition was as bloated as his waistline, made an announcement that defied all economic logic of the era. He had purchased a single soul for the staggering sum of $3,000, a king's ransom at a time when a skilled laborer cost a fraction of that amount. But this was no ordinary man. Standing at a terrifying 7 feet, 7 inches, Josiah was a mountain of scarred muscle and silent defiance, an investment Whitmore believed would secure his legacy in St. Mary Parish. The elite white society looked on with a mix of envy and mockery, completely unaware that they weren't witnessing a purchase, but the introduction of a catalyst for their total annihilation. By midnight of his first day at Magnolia Plantation, 13 men would be cold in the earth, the manor would be a pyre of ash, and the giant would have vanished into the mist like a vengeful ghost. Before we unravel the bone-chilling events of that night, I want to hear from you. If you were standing in that market in 1859, what would be the first thing you'd think seeing a man of that size in chains? Let me know in the comments. Now let us step back into the dust of the New Orleans streets to see where the tragedy truly began. The French Quarter in 1859 was a cacophony of commerce and cruelty, a place where the scent of expensive jasmine perfumes mingled with the stench of the slave pens. The auction block on Rue Royale was a stage where human dignity was stripped for profit, and on this Tuesday the atmosphere was electric with a dark sort of anticipation. Rumors had been circulating for days about Lot 47, a specimen of such gargantuan proportions that many believed him to be a myth. When the heavy iron gates of the holding pen finally creaked open, the usual chatter of the traders died in their throats. It took 6 armed men to lead Josiah onto the wooden platform, not because he struggled, but because his mere presence seemed to warp the space around him. He moved with a heavy, rhythmic grace, the specially forged chains on his wrists and ankles, links twice the thickness of standard iron, clinking with a sound that felt like a funeral bell. He stood nearly 2 feet taller than the auctioneer Deru, who had to stand on a crate just to appear relevant next to the man he intended to sell. To the buyers, Josiah was a freak of nature, a biological marvel to be exploited. To the other enslaved people watching from the shadows, he was something else entirely, a figure from an older, darker prophecy that promised an end to their long night of suffering. Among the crowd stood Bo Regard Whitmore and his overseer, a man named Tucker whose soul had been hardened into flint by decades of enforcing the peculiar institution. Whitmore wasn't there to buy a field hand, he was there to buy respect. He was a man desperately trying to claw his way into the inner sanctum of the Brotherhood, a secret society of the parish's most powerful and ruthless elite. To Whitmore, Josiah was the ultimate status symbol, a piece of property so rare and powerful that it would prove his worthiness to the men who pulled the strings of Louisiana's shadow government. Tucker, however, looked at the giant with a different kind of intensity. As a man who relied on the whip to maintain the natural order, he saw in Josiah a challenge that made the hair on his arms stand up. While Whitmore saw a $3,000 miracle, Tucker saw a predator disguised in chains. He watched as the bidding escalated, moving past $2,500 and then $2,000, leaving wealthy planters from Mississippi and Texas shaking their heads in disbelief. When Whitmore finally shouted, "3,000, the crowd gasped as if he had just committed a public sin. He had spent more than he could afford, mortgaging his future on a man whose eyes held a depth of intelligence and patience that Tucker found deeply disturbing. A look that suggested the giant wasn't being sold to Whitmore, but was choosing to go with him. After the gavel fell and the paperwork was signed in ink that smelled of copper, Whitmore approached his new property for the first time. The contrast was almost comical, the rotund, sweating master looking up at the towering, silent giant. Whitmore, puffing on an expensive cigar, blew a cloud of smoke into Josiah's face, a calculated gesture of dominance intended to establish the hierarchy immediately. "Do you understand English?" Whitmore asked. his voice wavering slightly despite his attempt at bravado. The response came not in the broken dialect common among the newly arrived, but in a voice that rumbled like a tectonic shift deep beneath the earth. "Yes, master," Josiah replied, his articulation perfect and his gaze unwavering. This was the first psychological blow to the captors. A slave who spoke with the clarity of a scholar was far more dangerous than one who didn't, as it implied a mind that couldn't be easily broken or deceived. Tucker, standing just behind Whitmore, instinctively gripped the handle of his bullwhip, the leather stained dark with the history of 100 other men's blood. He sensed that the standard methods of breaking would be useless here. Josiah wasn't looking at them with hatred or fear. He was looking at them with the clinical observation of a man measuring a grave. It was a standoff of wills that Whitmore was too arrogant to notice, but one that Tucker felt in his very marrow. As the sun began to dip below the wrought-iron balconies of the quarter, casting long, distorted shadows across the cobblestones, the convoy prepared to depart for the long trek towards St. Mary Parish. The group consisted of 6 white men, all armed with rifles and revolvers, and 7 massive slave dogs, a brutal crossbreed of bloodhound and mastiff trained to associate the scent of dark skin with the reward of violence. These beasts, usually lunging and snarling at any captive, seemed strangely subdued in Josiah's presence. They circled him, their yellowed fangs bared, yet they kept a respectful distance, their growls sounding more like whimpers of uncertainty than threats of aggression. As Josiah was led out of the market, an old enslaved man chained nearby began to weep, a loud racking sound that echoed off the brick walls. He cried out in a dialect that Tucker didn't recognize, but the tone was one of ancient mourning and terrifying warning. To the white men it was just the superstitious caterwauling of the elderly, but to Josiah it was a salutation. He didn't turn his head, but his pace remained steady, his massive frame absorbing the 40 pounds of iron as if it were made of silk. He walked out of New Orleans, not as a prisoner being led to a cage, but as a storm front moving toward a dry forest, carrying with him the sparks that would soon ignite the greatest conflagration the South had ever seen. The road out of New Orleans toward the swamplands of the West was a jagged scar through the landscape, a path of dust and misery that had seen thousands of souls march to their doom. As the convoy moved, the heat of the Louisiana afternoon became a physical weight, turning the air into a shimmering furnace. Whitmore rode at the head, his expensive silk shirt already translucent with sweat, but his face wore the smug grin of a man who believed he had cheated fate. He chatted aimlessly with the other riders about the productivity Josiah would bring to the harvest, calculating the bushels of rice and cotton that would be extracted from the giant's labor. They spoke of Josiah as if he were a piece of heavy machinery, a steam engine made of meat and bone. Meanwhile, Tucker stayed at the rear, his eyes never leaving the giant's back. He noticed things the others missed, the way Josiah's stride never faltered even in the deep ruts of the road, the way he didn't seem to pant or thirst despite the oppressive humidity. The overseer was a student of human suffering, and he knew that every man had a breaking point where the body betrayed the spirit. But as the miles stretched on, Josiah seemed to be drawing strength from the very earth beneath his feet, his massive silhouette casting a shadow that seemed to grow longer and darker with every step they took toward the Magnolia gates. As they reached the edge of the deep timberline where the civilized world began to bleed into the untamed bayou, the group paused for a final moment of respite before entering the darkness of the swamp. It was here that the first crack in the captor's facade appeared. One of the younger guards, a boy barely 20 named Clayton, tried to offer Josiah a ladle of water, perhaps out of a lingering sense of humanity or simple curiosity. Tucker slapped the ladle away before it could reach the giant's lips, the water spilling into the thirsty dust. "You don't feed the fire, boy," Tucker hissed, his hand resting on the pommel of his revolver. He wanted Josiah to feel the hunger, to feel the thirst, to acknowledge his mortality and, by extension, his subjection to the men who controlled the resources. Josiah finally turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto Tucker's. There was no plea for mercy, no flash of anger, only that same terrifying patience. It was the look of a mountain watching a man try to move it with a spoon. In that silence, the power dynamic shifted. Whitmore was the owner, Tucker was the master of the whip, but as the first owls of the evening began to call from the cypress trees, everyone in that convoy knew that they were no longer the ones in control. They were merely the ushers, leading a force of nature toward the home they thought was safe, unaware that the giant had already decided who would live and who would burn. The air changed as they crossed the invisible threshold into the great Louisiana bayou, shifting from the dry heat of the road to a wet, suffocating thickness that smelled of ancient peat and slow-moving decay. Here the sunlight didn't fall. It filtered through the gnarled branches of cypress trees draped in Spanish moss, creating a twilight world of emerald shadows and charcoal mist. The horses became skittish, their ears pinned back as they stepped into the murky edges of the swamp, sensing the presence of predators that had ruled these waters since before the first brick of New Orleans was laid. Josiah, however, seemed to expand in this environment. The 40 pounds of iron dragging behind him didn't snag on the twisted roots or sink into the black, sucking mud. He stepped with a precision that defied his massive frame, his eyes tracking the movement of the dragonflies and the ripples in the water with a predatory focus of his own. Tucker noticed that the giant was no longer just a prisoner. He was becoming a part of the landscape, a shadow among shadows. The overseer's grip on his rifle tightened until his knuckles were white, realizing that in this labyrinth of water and wood, the white man's law was a fragile, flickering candle against a rising tide of primordial darkness. Before we continue into the heart of the swamp, tell me, have you ever been in a place where you felt the environment itself was turning against you? Describe that feeling in the comments. Deep within the impenetrable thickets of the swamp, a sound began, a low rhythmic thrumming that felt less like music and more like a collective heartbeat. These were the drums of the Maroons, the legendary communities of those who had escaped their chains and carved out a secret, defiant existence in the heart of the bayou. To the plantation owners, this sound was a harbinger of theft and rebellion, a constant reminder that their property could vanish and become something dangerous. To the guards, it was a psychological assault, a series of complex polyrhythms that seemed to communicate across the distance in a language they couldn't decipher but could certainly feel in their bones. The horses tossed their manes in agitation, and the slave dogs, usually so eager for the hunt, began to huddle closer to the riders, their earlier aggression replaced by a shivering, ancestral dread. Josiah didn't miss a beat of the rhythm. His chest seemed to vibrate in sync with the distant skin drums. He wasn't just listening, he was participating in a silent coordination of intent that bridged the gap between his chains and the free people of the wilderness. Tucker shouted for the men to pick up the pace, his voice cracking with the realization that they were being watched by hundreds of eyes that recognized the giant not as a victim, but as the king they had been waiting for. They soon reached the Old Widow's Crossing, a rickety timber bridge that spanned a section of the bayou where the water was so dark and still it looked like polished obsidian. The structure groaned under the weight of the horses, but it wasn't the instability of the wood that gave the men pause. It was what lay beneath. Normally, alligators in the Louisiana heat are sluggish, drifting logs of prehistoric indifference, but today the water was teeming with them. Dozens of massive saurians had congregated around the pilings, their armored heads bobbing on the surface, their golden eyes fixed upward in an eerie, unblinking vigil. They weren't fighting or feeding, they were waiting, arranged in a rough ceremonial circle as if summoned by a power beyond human understanding. Whitmore, his face pale and slick with terror, ordered the crossing to proceed one by one. The tension was a physical cord stretched to the snapping point. Each rider held his breath as the planks creaked, and the alligators hissed in a low, collective warning that sounded like steam escaping a boiler. It was a scene of unnatural geometry, a moment where the wild world seemed to pause its chaos to observe a higher authority. When it was Josiah's turn to step onto the wood, the bridge shrieked in protest, the heavy iron of his shackles dragging across the timber like a serrated knife, and the water below began to churn as if the very depths were boiling with anticipation. Midway across the narrow span, Josiah stopped. He didn't stumble or falter. He simply ceased his forward motion, a mountain of black muscle silhouetted against the emerald rot of the swamp. In the absolute silence that followed, he began to hum, a deep, resonant vibration that didn't sound like a human voice, but like the groaning of the earth itself. It was an ancient melody, something carried in the blood from a continent thousands of miles away. And as the sound filled the air, the alligators beneath the bridge began to thrash in a synchronized frenzy. The guard Perkins, whose horse was already near its breaking point, lost control as the animal reared in blind panic. In a chaotic blur of leather and screaming, Perkins was thrown from his saddle, missing the wooden planks and plunging into the dark, waiting water. The scream he let out was short and sharp, cut off almost instantly as the water erupted in a violent explosion of foam and red mist. There was no struggle, only the systematic efficiency of nature reclaiming a trespasser. The alligators hit him with the force of 1,000 years of hunger, tearing the man apart with a cold, mechanical precision that left the survivors paralyzed with horror. Josiah stood through it all, unmoved, his humming continuing as a low, terrifying requiem for the man who had only moments ago joked about the market price of a human soul. When the remaining men finally scrambled onto the far bank, gasping for air and clutching their weapons as if they could shoot the very atmosphere, the reality of their situation began to settle in like a cold, poisonous fog. Tucker leveled his rifle at Josiah's chest, his finger trembling on the trigger, his mind unable to reconcile what he had just witnessed. "You did that," he hissed, his voice a jagged edge of accusation. "You called them. You killed him with that devil song." Josiah turned his head slowly, his eyes reflecting the dying light of the swamp with an intensity that made Tucker's courage wither. "I am a man in chains, master," Josiah replied, the title dripping with a sarcasm that was heavier than the iron on his wrists. "A man fell. The water took him. Is the swamp now under your law as well?" The logic was unassailable, yet every instinct in Tucker's body screamed that they were in the presence of something that could command the very elements of the earth. Whitmore, ever the coward, refused to acknowledge the supernatural undertone, fearful that admitting Josiah was anything other than property would mean admitting his $3,000 investment was a death warrant. He ordered the march to continue, forcing the men to bury their terror under the guise of duty, but the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was filled with the knowledge that Perkins was only the first installment of a debt that was about to be paid in full. As the shadows of the cypress trees lengthened into grasping fingers, the physical toll of the journey began to break the men and the beasts alike. The horses were lathered in white foam, their lungs heaving with the effort of navigating the thick mud, and the slave dogs were now whimpering openly, their tails tucked between their legs as they avoided looking at the giant. The white men, supposedly the masters of this domain, were red-faced and trembling, their expensive clothes ruined by the swamp and their spirits shattered by the sudden, brutal death of their comrade. Yet Josiah remained a machine of perfect, inhuman endurance. He didn't sweat, he didn't stumble, he didn't ask for the water that the men were now hoarding in their desperation. He walked like an inevitable tide, his pace the same rhythmic, soul-crushing beat it had been since they left the New Orleans market. He was the only one who seemed to belong in this encroaching darkness, his massive frame absorbing the gloom until he was almost invisible, except for the dull, rhythmic glint of the specially forged iron. Every step he took toward Magnolia was a step further away from the world of men and closer to the world of judgment. Tucker, riding at the rear, realized with a sickening jolt that they weren't leading Josiah to the plantation. Josiah was leading them to the place where he intended for them to die, and the swamp was providing him with the perfect theater for the final act. Finally, the trees began to thin, and the vast, geometric fields of Magnolia Plantation emerged from the mist like a vision of ordered misery. The rice paddies, silver in the rising moonlight, were filled with hundreds of bowed backs, men and women who had been systematically broken by the very system that Whitmore represented. As the convoy passed, a strange ripple moved through the workers. They didn't look up, for that would invite the lash of the whip, but their bodies tensed in a collective silent recognition. It was a telepathic transmission of hope and terror. They felt the arrival of the giant as a change in the air pressure, a shift in the gravity of their very existence. Josiah didn't speak, but his presence was a loud, clanging bell in the psychic space of the plantation. He looked at the white columns of the manor house, the big house, not with awe, but with the cold, clinical appraisal of a demolitionist looking at a condemned structure. The gates of Magnolia groaned open to receive them, the heavy iron bars sliding into place with a finality that should have felt like security to Whitmore. Instead, it felt like the closing of a trap. As they entered the central courtyard where the branding brazier already glowed with a hungry, orange light, Josiah stopped once more. He looked up at the stars, and for the first time, A small, dark smile touched his lips. The journey was over, the pieces were in place, and the night of reckoning had finally arrived. The central courtyard of Magnolia Plantation was a theatre of cruelty, illuminated by the flickering, hellish orange glow of a blacksmith's brazier. As the moon climbed higher, casting the long, skeletal shadows of the oak trees across the dirt, the ritual of ownership began. This was the branding square, a place where the human spirit was meant to be permanently extinguished by the searing heat of an iron rod. Bo Regard Whitmore stood on the porch of the big house, clutching a crystal glass of bourbon, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and triumph. He had summoned the branding master, a burly, weathered man named Collins, to mark the giant with the initials of the Whitmore estate. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke and the metallic tang of heated iron. 4 guards, their rifles leveled at Josiah's heart, forced the giant to his knees. The chains that had survived the swamp journey were removed to expose the flesh between his massive shoulder blades. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crackle of the embers. Josiah didn't resist. He lowered his body with a deliberate, slow-motion grace that felt less like submission and more like a predator crouching before a strike. The guards, sensing the change in the air, kept their distance, their fingers trembling on their triggers, as they looked upon a man who seemed to dwarf the very courtyard in which he was held. Collins approached with the branding iron, its tip white-hot and shimmering with lethal intent. He was a man who had branded 1,000 souls, a man whose heart had been cauterized by his own trade. Yet as he stepped within the giant's shadow, he faltered. Josiah turned his head not to plead, but to look. The eye contact was a physical blow. In those dark, ancient depths, Collins didn't see a slave. He saw a mirror of every sin he had ever committed, and more terrifyingly, he saw a future that didn't include him. The blacksmith's hand began to shake with a violent, uncontrollable palsy. The iron, which usually felt like an extension of his own arm, suddenly became a leaden weight. A cold, existential dread washed over him, a realization that to touch this man with fire would be to ignite his own soul. To the shock of Whitmore and the gathered overseers, Collins dropped the iron into the dirt, where it hissed and spat in the dust. The blacksmith stumbled backward, his face a mask of ashen terror, making soft, whimpering sounds of a man who had just seen the face of his own inevitable end. He pointed a trembling finger at Josiah, but no words came out, only a choked gasp of pure, primal recognition. The property was untamable, and the master was suddenly terrifyingly exposed. This defiance was a direct insult to the Brotherhood, a secret cabal of 13 men who truly ruled St. Mary Parish. This was not a mere social club, it was a shadow government born of blood and land greed, a brotherhood that practiced rituals in the deep swamp that would make a God-fearing man's blood turn to ice. They believed in a shadow law, a philosophy that stated some men were born to be gods and others to be footstools, and they maintained this hierarchy through systematic terror. Whitmore had spent his life savings and his very soul to be accepted by these men, to sit at their table and share in their dark power. The Brotherhood was obsessed with bloodlines and ancient lore, and they had heard whispers of a figure in African prophecy known as the One Who Returns, a warrior priest who would come when the cup of suffering was overflowing to balance the scales of justice. They had laughed at the stories over their fine wine, dismissing them as the superstitious ramblings of a broken people. But as they stood on the edges of the courtyard, watching the branding iron lie cold in the dirt, the laughter died. They realized that Whitmore hadn't just bought a giant, he had unknowingly invited the very avatar of their destruction into the heart of their sanctuary. Josiah remained on his knees, yet even in that posture, he radiated a terrifying authority. He began to speak, his voice a low, melodic rumble that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. He didn't speak in English, nor in any tongue the white men had ever heard. It was a language of clicking consonants and deep, rolling vowels that sounded like the tide pulling back before a tsunami. As the words echoed off the white columns of the manor, the atmosphere of the plantation began to warp. The temperature dropped, and a unnatural mist began to roll in from the rice fields, carrying with it the scent of ozone and wet earth. Tucker, the overseer, felt a cold sweat break out across his brow. He realized that Josiah wasn't just talking, he was signaling. The complex rhythms of the drums they had heard in the swamp were now being mirrored by the giant's speech. It was a call to arms that transcended language, a vibration that reached into the quarters where hundreds of enslaved men and women were suddenly rising from their pallets, their eyes snapping open in a collective moment of awakening. The psychological walls of the plantation, built over generations of fear and pain, were crumbling in a matter of seconds under the weight of a single man's voice. Tucker realized with a sickening jolt of clarity that the elite men surrounding him were actually cowards. They relied on the system, on the guns and on the chains, but without those tools they were nothing more than soft, frightened creatures. He looked at Whitmore, who was now babbling orders that no one was following, his face a grotesque mask of confusion. The overseer knew that the natural order they had so carefully cultivated was a lie. The Brotherhood believed they were the masters of destiny, but they were merely the stewards of a dying age. Josiah rose to his full height, the chains on his wrists snapping with a sound like pistol shots. He didn't use a key, he didn't use a tool, he simply willed the iron to break, and it obeyed. He stood free in the center of the courtyard, a black silhouette against the white-hot core of the plantation's ego. He looked at the guards, not with malice, but with a clinical detachment that was far more frightening. "The debt is called," he said in English, his voice clear and resonant. "The interest has been paid in tears, but the principal is due in blood." In that moment, the first torch was lit in the darkness beyond the gates, a tiny spark of orange that was immediately joined by dozens, then hundreds more, as the maroon warriors emerged from the tree line like a forest coming to life. The gathering storm was no longer a metaphor, it was a physical presence that compressed the air in the courtyard. The slave dogs, once the pride of the estate's security, were now nowhere to be seen, having fled into the crawl spaces beneath the buildings to escape the aura of the giant. The maroon messengers, men who had lived in the shadows of the swamp for decades, were now standing at the very gates of Magnolia. They were armed with the tools of their oppression, machetes, axes, and heavy wooden staves, but they held them with the discipline of a professional army. They were the invisible people who had been forgotten by the census and the law, and they had come to claim their seat at the table of the living. The drums in the distance reached a crescendo, a thundering wall of sound that drowned out the panicked shouts of the overseers. The Brotherhood, the men who believed they were untouchable, now found themselves trapped within the very walls they had built to keep the world out. They were surrounded by a history they had tried to erase, and led by a man they had tried to brand. The night was no longer a time for sleep. It was the beginning of a long, fiery morning where the sun would rise on a world that would never be the same again. The silence of the Louisiana night didn't just break, it was detonated. As the first maroon torches crested the horizon, the heavy iron-reinforced gates of Magnolia Plantation, symbols of an unbreakable hierarchy, were struck by a force that seemed more elemental than human. With a sound like a thunderclap echoing through a canyon, the wooden pillars splintered and the gates groaned on their hinges before collapsing into the dirt. A wave of humanity poured through the breach, a tide of liberated souls whose faces were illuminated by the orange flicker of 100 brands. These were not the docile property Whitmore had imagined. These were warriors who had spent decades sharpening their resolve in the blackest corners of the swamp. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized purpose, cutting off the escape routes to the river and the main road with military precision. In the center of the chaos stood Josiah, his massive silhouette framed by the rising smoke, a silent conductor for a symphony of retribution that had been centuries in the making. Before the flames take hold of the manor, I want to ask you, in a moment of total societal collapse, do you think a man is defined by his fear or by what he tries to save? Share your perspective in the comments as we watch the big house begin to tremble. Inside the manor, Bo Regard Whitmore's world was shrinking to the size of a single candlelit room. The opulence that had once served as his shield, the velvet curtains imported from France, the crystal decanters, the portraits of ancestors who had built their fortunes on the backs of the broken, now felt like a gilded cage. He clutched a pearl-handled pistol, his hands shaking so violently the barrel tapped a rhythmic, frantic beat against the mahogany desk. Beside him, Tucker looked out the window at the sea of torches, his face a pale mask of grim realization. The overseer had spent 30 years believing that the whip was the ultimate authority, a tool that could bend any will to his own. But as he watched Josiah walk calmly through a hail of poorly aimed musket fire, the bullet seemingly vanishing into the giant's aura of invulnerability, Tucker knew the truth. The power they had wielded was a fragile ghost, a consensus of fear that had finally been revoked. The Brotherhood had built their temple on a foundation of sand, and the tide had finally come in. There would be no reinforcements from the Parish. The drums they had heard in the swamp had already signaled similar uprisings across the region, isolating the elite in their own burning sanctuaries. The violence was not random. It was a surgical extraction of a cancer that had long plagued the bayou. The rebels didn't just burn, they targeted the instruments of their agony. The blacksmith shop, where the branding irons and shackles were forged, was the first to be leveled. The very tools of bondage melted down in their own forge. The administrative offices, containing the ledgers of debt and the sale records that separated mothers from children, were cast into the courtyard to be fed to the rising pyres. The air grew thick and heavy, a suffocating mixture of sweet jasmine and the acrid stench of burning pine and scorched wool. Guards who had once took pleasure in the correction of their captives now found themselves pleading for a mercy they had never shown. Josiah moved through the carnage like a ghost of the future, never raising a hand in anger, yet his presence seemed to guide the blades of the vengeful. He was the living embodiment of the one who returns, a figure whose mere existence validated the rage of the oppressed. As the first floor of the big house began to roar with a hunger that could not be sated, Josiah stepped onto the veranda, his eyes fixed on the secret safe hidden behind the library's false wall. The fire began to climb the white columns of the manor, licking at the paint until it bubbled and blackened like rotting skin. It was a beautiful, terrible purification, a light so bright it could be seen from miles away, signaling to every plantation along the Mississippi that the old world was dying. In the library, Josiah moved with a calm that defied the collapsing ceiling around him. He reached into the hidden compartment where Whitmore kept the dark ledger, the secret records of the Brotherhood. This book contained the names, the rituals, and the documented crimes of the 13 men who believed themselves the gods of St. Mary Parish. To the rebels, the house was a symbol to be destroyed, but to Josiah, the ledger was a weapon to be preserved. He wrapped the volume in heavy oilcloth, shielding it from the heat as the floorboards beneath him began to groan. He knew that fire could destroy the wood and the stone, but only the truth could destroy the legacy of the men who built it. As he exited the burning structure, the roof finally gave way, a shower of sparks and flaming timber collapsing into the foyer, erasing the Whitmore name from the map of Louisiana in a single roaring instant of absolute judgment. Whitmore and Tucker were cornered in the courtyard, the very place where they had intended to brand Josiah only hours before. They were surrounded by a circle of men whose scars told the story of Magnolia's prosperity, a history written in welts and broken bones. There were no speeches, no dramatic declarations of intent. The time for words had passed decades ago. The 7 slave dogs, once the terrors of the swamp, now lay dead or had fled into the night, leaving their masters to face the music alone. Tucker, ever the fighter, raised his whip one last time, a desperate, pathetic gesture of a man who didn't know how to exist in a world where he wasn't the monster. A dozen machetes rose in unison, the moonlight glinting off their edges with a cold silver promise. The reckoning was swift and silent, a settling of accounts that left the dirt of the courtyard stained with the blood of the men who had thought themselves untouchable. Josiah watched from the shadows of the gate, the dark ledger tucked under his arm. He didn't celebrate the death, he merely acknowledged the closing of a chapter. The Brotherhood was broken, and as the heat of the fire began to fade into the cool mist of the swamp, the giant turned his back on the ruins of Magnolia, moving toward the deep timber where a new history was waiting to be written. By the time the moon began its descent, Magnolia Plantation was nothing more than a blackened skeleton of ash and iron, a smoldering wound on the landscape. The hundreds who had lived there in chains were gone, vanished into the protective embrace of the bayou, guided by the maroon warriors who knew every secret path through the water. They carried with them only what was necessary: food, supplies, and the newfound knowledge that they were no longer property. The local authorities would later find 13 bodies in the ruins, the inner circle of the parish elite who had gathered that night to witness the taming of the giant. The reports would speak of a mysterious insurrection, blaming outside agitators and northern spies, unable to admit that the fire had been lit from within. But the legends that grew in the slave quarters of the neighboring estates told a different story. They spoke of the man who was too big for chains, the man who called the alligators and broke the iron with his mind. They spoke of Josiah, the architect of the Night of Ash, whose name became a whispered prayer for anyone still waiting for the dawn. The world of 1859 was still a dark place, but for one night in St. Mary Parish, the light of justice had burned brighter than the sun. The dawn that rose over St. Mary Parish on April 16, 1859, was a sickly, bruised purple, as if the sky itself had been traumatized by the fires that consumed the night. When the local militia and neighboring planters finally arrived at the gates of Magnolia, they found a landscape that defied their understanding of the social order. The big house was a hollowed-out skull of masonry, its grand white columns collapsed like the rib cage of a fallen beast, still smoldering with a heat that drove the investigators back. There were no survivors to tell the story of the giant or the drums. Only the 13 bodies of the Brotherhood's inner circle lay cooling in the dirt of the courtyard, their faces frozen in expressions of terror that suggested they had looked into the eyes of a primordial judgment. Most baffling to the authorities was the total absence of the hundreds of enslaved people who had worked these fields for generations. It was as if the earth had opened up and swallowed them whole. No tracks led to the main road, and the hounds refused to pick up a scent, whining and retreating whenever they were pressed toward the swamp's edge. Before we conclude this epic of shadows and steel, tell me, do you believe that some places on earth hold the memory of what happened there forever? Or does time eventually wash all sins away? I look forward to your thoughts in the comments. In the weeks that followed, a quiet, surgical terror gripped the remaining elite across Louisiana. They had always believed that their secret rituals and shadow law made them untouchable, but they soon discovered that Josiah had left them with a legacy far more dangerous than fire. The dark ledger, the oilcloth-wrapped record of their atrocities, was gone, and with it, their sense of security. One by one, the men who had escaped the night at Magnolia began to meet ends that were as mysterious as they were poetic. Judge Pelam, a man known for sentencing runaways to the gallows with a smile, was found dead in a hunting blind, his own musket discharged in a way that defied the laws of physics. Reverend Crenshaw, who had used the pulpit to justify the natural order of bondage, vanished during a midnight storm. His church burned to the ground by a fire that witnesses claimed moved against the wind and hissed with a human voice. The surviving members of the Brotherhood whispered of a giant in the woods, a figure that haunted the periphery of their vision, a mountain of a man who didn't kill with his hands, but who seemed to orchestrate the very elements of the bayou to deliver a final verdict. The Brotherhood didn't just collapse, it was systematically erased from the parish, its members consumed by the very darkness they had tried to master for profit. While the South began to simmer with the rising heat of the coming Civil War, Josiah was moving through the invisible arteries of the Underground Railroad, a shadow among shadows. He was no longer a piece of property valued at $3,000. He was a man who had reclaimed his soul through fire and iron. His journey north was a masterclass in psychological warfare and survival. He didn't hide in the floorboards or the false bottoms of wagons like many fugitives. He moved through the deep woods with a confidence that made the patrollers and professional slave catchers hesitate. There are accounts from that time of men who swore they saw a giant walking across the moonlit ridges of the Appalachians, carrying a heavy bundle as if it were a holy relic. To the fugitives he encountered, he was a beacon of hope, a living proof that the chains could be broken if one possessed enough patience. By the time he crossed into the free soil of Pennsylvania, the name Josiah had been shed like a dead skin. He took the surname Freeman, a name that was both a declaration of his status and a promise to the future. Josiah Freeman didn't just want to be free. He wanted to ensure that the concept of ownership was buried so deep it would never see the light of day again, and he carried the proof of his enemies' crimes as his only luggage. In Philadelphia, Josiah became a pillar of the abolitionist movement, though he remained a man of few words and immense quiet presence. He lived in a modest brick house with his wife Rebecca, a woman who had escaped her own horrors in Virginia, and found in Josiah a strength that was both terrifying and protective. He worked as a freight handler at the bustling docks, his massive frame doing the work of 5 men without ever showing signs of fatigue. But his true labor took place in the secret rooms of the Anti-Slavery Society. He finally unwrapped the dark ledger, presenting the documented crimes of the Louisiana Brotherhood to influential men like William Still and Frederick Douglass. These records became a vital weapon in the ideological war against the South, providing cold, hard evidence that the plantation system was not a benevolent institution, but a criminal conspiracy of the highest order. Josiah refused to let the names in that book be forgotten, ensuring that the history of Magnolia was preserved not as a legend of a rebellious slave, but as a legal indictment of a monstrous regime. He raised 3 sons in that house, teaching them to read the very books the law once forbade him to touch, and instilling in them the knowledge that their father was not a giant because of his height, but because he had dared to stand up when the world told him to kneel. When the drums of war finally shook the foundations of the United States in 1861, Josiah Freeman was already in his early 40s, his hair silvered like the moss of the bayou, but his strength remained undiminished by age. Though he was technically too old to serve in the front lines of the United States colored troops, he became an invaluable asset to the Union intelligence services. He was a Black Scout, a man who could slip through the Confederate lines and return with maps and troop movements that seemed impossible to obtain for any ordinary soldier. He led raids on plantations across the South, not for the sake of plunder, but to liberate the captive and to identify the men who had been secret members of the Brotherhood. He saw the fall of Richmond with his own eyes, and he stood in the ruins of the slave markets he had once been sold in, watching as the auction blocks were chopped into firewood for the Union campfires. There was no joy in his expression, only a profound, silent satisfaction. The feeling of a long, arduous work finally reaching its natural conclusion. He saw the passage of the 13th Amendment, and for the first time in his life, he let out a breath he felt he had been holding since he was a child on the shores of Africa. The balance had been restored, and the investments of men like Whitmore had been rendered worthless by the fire of 1,000 suns. Josiah Freeman lived to see the turn of the century, passing away in the winter of 1899 at the age of 81. His funeral was a silent, somber affair that drew hundreds from across the North, men who had been helped by the Underground Railroad, soldiers who had followed his scouts into the Virginia wilderness, and families who knew him only as the gentle giant of Philadelphia. He died in his sleep, his massive hands resting on the oilcloth cover of the dark ledger, which he had willed to the archives of a newborn university. The newspapers of the day gave him a standard obituary, calling him a respected citizen and industrious laborer, completely unaware of the fire and blood that defined his youth in St. Mary Parish. They didn't know about the alligators at the bridge, or the branding iron that wouldn't burn his skin, or the iron gates that he had willed to shatter. His story was buried under the polite fictions of a country trying to move on from its sins, but the legacy he left behind was a permanent shift in the moral gravity of the South. He had proven that one man, if he possesses enough patience and resolve, can be the spark that topples an entire empire of cruelty. He died a man of property, but the only thing he truly owned was his own destiny, and that was more than enough. Today, if you travel to the place where Magnolia Plantation once stood, you will find nothing but a quiet suburban development and a stretch of untamed swamp that refuses to be drained by modern machinery. There is no historical marker for Josiah, no plaque commemorating the night 13 men died for their crimes against humanity. The forest has reclaimed the bricks of the manor, and the water has washed away the ash of the slave quarters. But those who live near the edge of the bayou still tell stories to their children. They say that on the nights when the humidity is so thick you can taste the salt of old tears, you can still hear the rhythmic clinking of chains moving through the cypress trees. They say that the alligators still gather in circles around the old bridge pilings, waiting for a command that hasn't been spoken in over a century. History is not a dead thing. It is a living, breathing presence that shapes our present world, whether we acknowledge it or not. The story of Josiah reminds us that the arc of the moral universe does indeed bend toward justice, but it only bends when a hand as strong as a mountain reaches up and pulls it down. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the heart of the American darkness. If you found value in this story, share it with someone who needs to know that no chain is truly unbreakable. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon and never stop searching for the truth.